Yo, what's up, Paige? It's been a minute since we did a podcast, right?
Yeah, it's been a long
Y-
time coming.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, this was the Untitled Book Club podcast. But as we discussed a couple of episodes ago in an episode titled The Pivot, we actually wanted to transition from book-based podcasts because we found them quite limiting. For one, we enjoy reading and learning about a lot of different things. And to cover one book at a time kind of felt like we were pigeonholing ourselves. For two, because we were covering books and books are like 300, 400 pages long, we found ourselves having to be thorough, and that thoroughness came at a cost, which was like 3 hour long episodes. Those are some classic episodes, but people gave us feedback and was like, yo, your content is really good, but it's quite long and we have very busy days. So can you shorten it? So I got a special surprise for y'all. This is more of a post study session podcast, and it's going to be incredibly short. I imagine it's only going to be like 10 minutes because I've been doing a lot of research when it comes to businesses because I have a passion in business and I kind of want to start one day. And this is more so just like study notes that I just want to have a discussion with Paige with, and we're going to be in and out. So how does that sound, Paige?
No, that sounds good. Let's take it away.
Okay, let's get right into it. So I've been doing a lot of research for the past couple of weeks, and I want to break down my business research and the businesses I've been studying into three categories. These categories are traditional, software, and platform businesses. Now, traditional, we're going to lump majority of businesses in here. Software companies, I mean, I feel like that's kind of self-explanatory, and we're going to explain what a platform company is. Some people might have an intuitive understanding, and for people who are more business and client might already know what a lot of this information is. So I feel like I feel like I might be sharing things that some people might know, some people might not know. So we're gonna go through all of it. So first category, traditional businesses. So when you think of the traditional business, you think of industry titans from yesteryears. You think of Toyota, Sony, General Motors, Walmart. These are all vertically integrated businesses. These businesses have three types of marginal costs when it comes to serving the customer. One is cost of goods sold, distribution costs, and transaction costs. Traditional businesses dominate by becoming incredibly effective in like managing all three of these costs. These business models are good, but they're not great. These efficiencies at managing all three of these costs come at a huge cost in and of itself. Traditional businesses have to invest a lot of money into large factories, employees, elaborate distribution centers in order to sell a product. What do you think about that, Paige?
So you mentioned a few different types of costs that these traditional businesses can incur. So can
Yeah.
you elaborate on the definitions of what those costs are and maybe provide some examples?
Yeah, I'll be happy. So you have the first one is cost of goods sold, which is the cost it takes to produce the item or the service. So you can think of the actual raw materials, the components, the manufacturing process that goes into actually creating a product. So if you have, for example, a toothbrush, you have to get the bristle from somewhere. You have to get the plastic. I'm not exactly sure how toothbrushes are made. You have to mold it. You have to hire employees to actually produce the cost. I don't know why I picked toothbrushes, but it's
Yeah,
at
I'm
the
like, well,
top
I
of
don't
my
know
mind
the toothbrush.
because it's morning time. So I guess I just brushed my teeth. Anyways, you have the distribution cost next, and this is probably more obvious. It's the actual transportation cost. And for the sake of the conversation, we're also going to lump the actual physical place where the product is sold or the service is rendered into that. And lastly, you have the transaction cost. For every single product or service that's sold, you probably have to have customer service or someone at the register to ring up the product. And that is a per transaction cost that these businesses have to occur. Now, successful businesses in the past, like Walmart, become incredibly efficient at all three of these things. Toyota is another example. When you think of an industry titan, like let's say, for example, Henry Ford. For those who don't know, Henry Ford is the founder of Ford Motor Company, one of the very first car manufacturing companies in America. What he managed was what made him a genius is that he kind of innovated on the cost of goods sold part, which was creating an assembly line. You know, if you ever go to Subway, they assemble your sandwiches in an assembly line. A car is kind of made in a similar fashion. Previously, people just thought cars are more of an artisan work, so one person worked on one car, and which took cars days to be made. Whereas Henry Ford was like, okay, let's do this in an assembly line. One person specializes in this component, the next person specializes in that one, and so forth and so forth. And this way, you can literally do things in the assembly line, which increase efficiency. He was able to shrink in that time from a couple of days, like hours, to produce a car. And his cost of goods went tremendously down, which made cars cheaper, which made him one of the more dominant business people of his time. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, yeah, thank you for providing that example, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Um, and so now that we have these traditional businesses, you mentioned software businesses, how is that different?
So yeah, like I was saying, like, traditional businesses, they're good, but they're not great. So we're gonna talk about software companies. And it's pretty obvious if you look in today's world that software companies are some of the most powerful and profitable companies in the world. And there's reasons behind that. For one, software companies have zero marginal costs. So when you think of cost of goods sold, distribution costs, and transaction costs, they're all effectively zero. So let's go by one. Software companies, and the software that they create are digital products. So to actually create a piece of software, it does require a lot of upfront costs, hiring designers, project managers, developers, and anyone else is on the team, etc. But to actually produce each unit of software, you can just copy it. Once you make it, you can just copy it endlessly. The software code sits on a server and you can just replicate it endlessly. So they have a zero per unit cost. The next one is that software companies have an unlimited supply. So unlike Henry Ford, who has to find raw material after raw material, and maybe there's only a finite supply, and then they're impacted by supply and demand, software companies can endlessly replicate their products and their items, which means that on a per transaction level, the profit per unit sold is virtually 100%. Now you have distribution costs. Now, if I were selling, because I picked toothbrushes for the sake of this conversation. If I was selling toothbrushes, I have to actually produce the toothbrushes, put them inside of a truck, and then ship them all across America, and that would take forever. And if I want to go international, I have to ship them overseas, and that will cause my costs to go wildly up just so I can make a profit. But for software companies, their services are deliverable via the internet, and the internet, it costs virtually $0 to send a byte from Tokyo to London to Africa to New York City. So this is why software companies have been some of the more profitable companies, and they're way more recognizable compared to the traditional businesses. In fact, if you look at stock charts back in the 80s, obviously companies like GE in the US were the dominant companies of their time, as well as IBM and others. But nowadays, you see more so software companies such as Google. You may even see Adobe, the makers of Photoshop. If you guys are designers and editors, you might know what that is, et cetera, et cetera. Microsoft was once a software company and a platform company too, but we'll get into that later. Microsoft sold Microsoft Office, and that's how they became dominant, is by selling software. So again, software companies' products are digital. They have an unlimited supply as well as zero deliverable costs. And the last one, I forgot the last one, which is a per transaction cost. Software companies, because their storefronts rather are the internet as well, the per transaction cost is effectively zero. Now, this does come with some caveats. There might be some credit card payment processing, but they don't actually have to have an employee to sell someone the product like a car dealership. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And so, if I were to reiterate this to the audience,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm burning through
is it
these.
kind of like Fortnite? So I know there's, we might have some people who play Fortnite or Apex Legends who are viewing our content,
Hmm.
and in those video games, there's skins. So
Yeah.
from what you're saying, it's kind of like the upfront cost is creating that skin, or and for people who might not know what a skin is, it's like the outfit you put on your character.
Right.
But you might have some upfront cost with that skin, but once that skin is developed, it's remotely free for them to replicate it and
Hmm.
distribute it to the users who ultimately will pay for those skins.
Yeah.
Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about it. So you have a traditional business, like let's say, for example, Zara, H&M, and this is where you can see how things are differentiated between a software company and let's say, for example, a traditional business like Zara, H&M. If Zara wants to produce an article of clothing, if me and Paige ran Zara, we will have to hire designers, source our garments, and create all of these materials. And that has a huge upfront cost, very similar to software, just to get the initial prototypes and research done. But then on a per unit basis, we will actually have to purchase all the garments, hire factory workers, and we have to actually make and assemble the garments and then deliver them. Fortnite, a clothing maker in Fortnite, I'm using air quotes here, they just have to hire a team of a designer and a developer, a designer to actually create and design the actual clothes itself in the game, and a developer to actually program it. And then they just have to put it on a server somewhere, and then people are able to buy it with a zero per transaction costs. You see, like it's a way more effective business model because Zara has to incur costs at each level and each unit. So whereas Fortnite occurs one upfront cost and then everything else is virtually 100% profit. And this is why like video game makers are also some of the more profitable like companies as well. And so, now
Yeah.
that now
Hi.
that I cover software companies, I do want to, talk about platform companies. But before I do, Paige, you have another question?
Yeah. Well, more so a comment. So now that I understand how these software companies are, make a profit, I feel pretty silly for paying $20 for an Apex Legends skin
Yeah. Yeah.
when it's pretty much free for them to replicate and distribute.
Uh-huh.
And that makes sense why they're so profitable. But
Yeah.
no, thank you for explaining that. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm pretty
Yes.
sure there's probably a lot of people mad who bought Fortnite and like Apex Legends skins who might be watching this, our five viewers, and
Yeah. Yeah.
this is some good material.
For sure, for sure. So before I move on, but doesn't that kind of like make sense? Like when you think of the top entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurs that people know by name, almost all of them have built a name for themselves within software companies because they're insanely powerful and insanely profitable compared to some of their traditional counterparts. But you can actually level up a software company even more once you start going into what is a platform company. So, like I said before, I'm covering three types of companies. I'm covering traditional companies as well as software companies and platform companies. So we cover the advantages that a software company have to their traditional counterparts. But a software company can actually be taken to another level if you transform it into a platform company, which is the final category that I want to cover today. So a traditional business and a software business actually have a few things in common. Not the marginal costs, but ultimately they are producing a product and trying to sell it to a consumer. So they incur the liability of actually producing the product itself. What a platform company does differently than both of them is that like a software company, they create an application or they create a program. But the difference is that this program is not being sold. This program is merely just a facilitator of transactions. And before we get into what all of this mean, I want to give you examples of platform companies so it can like resonate with you more. A platform company is something like Uber, Airbnb, the Apple App Store, um, Instagram, YouTube, PayPal, Etsy, Square, Tinder, Amazon, etc. Now, what all of these companies have in common is that again, they don't create a piece of software to sell. They create an app, but the application is more of a service to connect suppliers to consumers. They're effectively middlemen, but really efficient ones. Does that make sense so far, Paige?
Yeah, can you dive in a little bit about and explain what are suppliers in this type of scenario? What does that mean?
For sure, for sure. So in a traditional and a software-based business, they handle the production of the actual product itself. But in a platform company, let's say for example, Uber, for the sake of this conversation, they don't actually hire the drivers or purchase the cars. They actually outsource that to the suppliers. The suppliers handle the production. They're effectively again middlemen for the actual consumers itself. So in another case, Amazon's another example. They built the Amazon storefront, and then third-party sellers handle, which are traditional businesses. Ironically, they plug into that channel and they handle all of the production. And Amazon just facilitate the sell and the actual consumer relationship. And when you go down the list, you see this. YouTube is another example. YouTube doesn't actually produce the videos on the platform. The actual YouTube content creators are the actual suppliers of the videos itself, and the people who watch the YouTube videos are the consumers. So let's go into one of the more important aspects of a platform company. So a platform company relies on something called network effects. In economics, a network effect is a phenomenon by which the value or the utility a user derives from a good or service depends on the amount of users that use the service itself. So a classic example of understanding a network effect is the invention of the telephone. Now, a telephone without a connection on the other end is one of the most useless pieces of devices ever. Its value depends on the connection of other telephones on a network. And as the number of connections increase and the more people who buy telephones increase, the value of the product increases as well. If there's one person who uses a telephone or two people that uses a telephone, it has a relatively minimum value. If there's millions of people and every single one of your friends use the telephone, the actual value of the telephone network and the telephone itself goes up. You see how that's different from like a traditional business and a traditional good? It doesn't matter if someone else buys a saw. I can use a saw myself and like it doesn't increase in value if my neighbor uses a saw. Or let's say, for example, I use a piece of software like Microsoft Word. It's probably very minimum value, traditionally speaking, if my neighbor uses Microsoft Word because I'm using it for myself. But in the case of a telephone, which is a very classic example, way before digital items was even created, the value of the telephone itself is useless intrinsically. What makes it valuable is the product and the network that surrounds the product. You know what I'm saying?
So it sounds like in order for these platform businesses to thrive, they need to make sure that they have this networking effect. And this seems like a chicken and an egg scenario. How do you
Mhm.
build your suppliers if you don't have any consumers? And how do you build your consumers if you don't have any suppliers? Like, which one do you solve first?
That's actually a great question. And there's no, silver bullet rule that all platform companies should follow, according to my research. Every single company had to handle the growth of their network differently. And in order to understand this, let's just take a couple of examples out of the companies that I named. I don't know if I mentioned Facebook. We're going to take Facebook as an example. Everybody uses Facebook. And as of right now, Facebook sits at, 2 billion users and probably on the verge of 3 billion. Who knows? So Facebook, when they were originally creating this application, Mark Zuckerberg, he was a college student in Harvard. He had, I don't know if he did this intuitively or what, but he had a very genius idea to make it exclusive to Harvard itself. For one, this created demand because Harvard wanted something that was very prestigious, a social media network that was very exclusive for Harvard people only. Yeah, there was competitors like MySpace and other college-based social media networks as well, but Harvard, the students at Harvard wanted something for themselves. So when Mark Zuckerberg created it, he had an instant supply of hyper relevant people who all knew each other, who were able to use the network and create value per transaction. Now, as he wanted to grow the network, he decided to move it to other Ivy League schools. And that was another genius move because he wanted to have Facebook brand perception relatively high. I mean, when we look at Facebook today, it's very different than what people looked at Facebook about 15 years ago. When he moved it to every single Ivy League school, it was still this high status social media network. You need to have a Harvard EDU or Ivy League EDU to even sign up. And he was growing a network within stages because managing the community is very important. You just don't want to just flip the switch and open it up to everybody because let's say, for example, me and Paige create our own social media network and we open it up to everybody. Someone in Tokyo and someone in Cleveland can use it, or like Seattle, for example. The first person who signs up in Cleveland is not going to find anyone else in Cleveland. The first person who signs up in Seattle is not going to find anyone in Seattle, and etc. But he did it on a community level. So he did it in Harvard. Then he moved on to the other Ivy League schools such as MIT, Princeton, Yale, etc. After he had that initial stage done, or the second stage done, he moved on to all colleges. But before he just opened it up to every single college, they had this pretty genius strategy, the community manager at Facebook, which was to introduce it to the colleges that are close to the colleges that already exist in the network. So if there was a college that was nearby Harvard or nearby Yale, nearby MIT, they would start to open up Facebook to those colleges first. But before they did, they waited until 20% of the student body was on a waiting list before they just made it available to that college. And that was actually a really good idea because it's solving the chicken and egg problem by just building up demand. If you put everybody on the waiting list and you have a unspoken release date, once 20% of the people sign up for the waiting list and you release it, 20% of the college campus student body will be on that platform, which means the other 80% can guarantee that when they sign up, they at least know one person on the platform, thus creating value in the network. And that was a pretty brilliant idea because, again, if you are the first person at your college to sign up for Facebook, but none of your friends or classmates uses Facebook, it's effectively irrelevant to you. So once he solved that college problem, he rolled it out one by one by one, literally in the web, going from region to region to region to eventually he expanded to every single college. Now he dominated. and the people at Facebook dominated all college students in America. If you were a college student back in 2006, there's a high degree that you use Facebook. I think the statistic was like 90% of college kids uses Facebook. Next, he wanted to move on to the more general public, and he broke them up into two classes: general adults and high school students. He didn't want to go to adults just yet because he wanted to, control the network. So he moved on to high school students. Now you have another chicken and the egg problem when it comes to high school kids. Generally speaking, high school kids will not find value in the social media network filled with college kids because none of their classmates is on it. So the way they rolled it out in Facebook is that a college person had to invite a high school kid onto the platform because a high school kid knows a college person. They found instant value in it. And I believe that high school kid was then able to invite their friends, and they were able to do it one by one. This guaranteed the network rolled out slowly over time and guaranteed that the high school students would know people because they stagnated the growth. And that's very important, as mentioned. Once all the high school kids signed up, they flipped the switch and made it available for all high school kids as well as all adults. And once done, I mean, once you cover all the high school kids in the US and college kids, you can effectively just make it open for all adults. And the chances of you knowing someone in college, if you're just an adult just working a regular 9 to 5 somewhere, is pretty high. So you either know someone in high school, you know someone who goes to college, and the network kind of creates this web. And the value of a social media network is determined. A quick and dirty metric to determine the value of a social media network is Metcalfe's law. So before I get into that, what makes platform companies particularly dominant is that once you build this network, it's really hard for somebody to take your place. So there's a reason why we haven't seen a new social media. We see very few new social media companies since Facebook. And the ones that we do use are, well, owned by Facebook. If you're a software company, that same zero marginal costs becomes those same three types of transactions you remember earlier in the podcast: zero distribution costs, zero per unit cost, zero manufacturing costs, and zero per transaction costs. Actually gives you a relatively low economic moat. And economic moat is the defensiveness that your business has against competition and people who want to remove you from your own business position. The same things that make software companies very dominant means that anyone can just copy their piece of software. If I'm able to duplicate the software, I can just copy it. And once I copy it, I can deliver it just as easily as you, and you have no real defense. A traditional business actually has huge defensive moats, although they don't scale as well as software companies. So a traditional business, once you build that trucking network that goes across the US and any other country that you live in, it's really hard for a competitor to do the exact same thing. Once you secure the suppliers, the manufacturers, and the talents that help make whatever product that you're making, you have a high moat. But a software company doesn't have any of that. A network company kind of has the defensiveness of a traditional company, but the endless replication of a software company. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. So again, once Facebook was able to create that network, it's really hard for other people to copy it, because if me and Paige were to create our own social media network, we'll have to compete with Facebook. Why would someone use our direct Facebook competitor if they can just go on Facebook itself and find their friends? You know what I'm saying? So Metcalfe's law is this idea that the value of a social media network is the amount of users squared. So meaning that if I have a social media network of 10 people and Paige has a social media network of, let's say, 100 people, it's the difference between our social media networks. If we had give a quick and dirty metric, it's not Paige has 90 more users than I do, and I have 90 less users. You actually have to square those users because those users are connected into a web, not in a linear chain. So what's, 100 squared? I think that's about 10,000 if my math serves me correctly, and 10 squared is 100. So the value of her network is exponentially higher than my network. So I just wanted to explain what Metcalfe's law is before I move on. So let's move on to Tinder. I want to give you guys another example. So Tinder did a very similar stagnant rollout as Facebook, but they did it in their own way. So when they created the application Tinder, the community manager at Tinder decided to give talks about dating and modern dating at local colleges and colleges all around the US. So what she would do is she would go to the sorority of any college, just say college A, and then she would give a talk about dating and online dating, trying to remove the stigma of online dating and encourage some of the women to sign up. So she would go to local sororities and encourage all the women to sign up. And once she gave that talk and made every single woman at the sorority sign up, she would then go to the fraternity immediately afterwards, like an hour later, while the network is still fresh, and give the exact same talk, but more geared towards men. And I'm pretty sure talk went like, yo, there's a bunch of hot girls in this app. You should download it and see if your friends match with you. And that's how they built the network. She went college by college doing this, effectively seeing the network. Because again, in a chicken and egg scenario, if the Tinder company were to just release Tinder out to the public and someone from Cleveland signed up and no one from Cleveland is on it, that person's going to immediately abandon the platform. But if you curate the network in the early stages and do like a stagnated rollout, you can actually grow it exponentially. So that's another example. And I don't know if I should, for the sake of the time, I don't want to go into why Uber, Airbnb, Instagram, and YouTube did it, because they're all their own independent strategies. But I just wanted to give you an idea of why platform companies are particularly powerful. So in the case of Facebook and Tinder, there's no surprise that those two are the big dominant ones in their categories, because once you create that network, it becomes hugely difficult for someone to create their own competing dating network. So if me and Paige create our own dating network, we will have to like solve that problem, and we'll have to convince people to leave Tinder to join our network. And users aren't just going to do that because they find no value, and we won't be able to win them over. So when you're starting a business, long story short, you have traditional businesses, you have software companies, you have platform companies. If you have the option to start a business in 2021, you should probably choose a platform company, because they're natural monopolies and they have a lot of defensive moats that protect you from competition. And that is our short podcast from all the things that I studied over the past couple of weeks. How does that sound?
That was great. Thank you so much, Terrance. I'm glad that you shared this knowledge with us, and I'm sure our viewers are super glad that you shared this knowledge with us as well. So thank you
Uh-huh.
for doing the reading and giving us the cliff notes
Uh-huh.
and the consolidated notes and
Yeah.
learnings of
Yeah.
those books. I know you said you read 5 of them, so that's a lot of books to read
Yeah.
in a month.
Yeah, it's crazy. Now, this podcast is more like jazz. Like I said, this is like a post-study session podcast, and we just appreciate you guys listening. We're experimenting with new content models, and this is just one of
Mhm.
them. So, yeah, I think it's good to end this episode. So, you want to do our
Yeah.
goodbyes?
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us for this episode X, because we don't remember what number
Uh,
we're on right now. But thank you for joining us,
Follow
and
us.
we can't wait to see you. Well, I don't know. Just can't wait to see you next time
See you
because we
again.
don't have a date.
See you again. So, thank you guys for listening. This podcast is short. We hope it's less than 20 minutes, and we're out. Peace.